Can you see a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay. Try to change my view here. Okay. So I have a PowerPoint based on the section of our textbook that addresses the topic of Keynes versus the classics. And let me start off with two approaches to economics. The first one is what he calls the classical, what we usually call the neoclassical approach. And I'm sure you know all of the assumptions that go into the model that I'll be presenting here. That is, there is a natural human nature, which is to maximize pleasure and avoid pain. And of course, we measure pleasure by utility. We assume that people are rational. And this is more than just the colloquial use of the term. It's a very specific meaning of what rational is. Individuals maximize utility, firms maximize profits. They are self-interested. They take prices as signals. Only their own utility matters to them. Other people's utility or disutility doesn't influence their decision process. The analysis begins with the individual. We assume they're rational. And as long as in society and the economy we get the incentives right, free markets work and they move you to an equilibrium. There is a long history of trying to demonstrate that a simple model like this could achieve an equilibrium. And by the late 1950s, it was demonstrated that on in a simple model with strict assumptions, you could show that equilibrium does exist. Another assumption is that marginal productivity holds, so that each factor of production gets what it deserves, that is determined by its marginal productivity. In this model, there's the invisible hand is supposed to work to move us to equilibrium. There's only a small role for government. There are some things that markets don't do well, and the government can provide goods and services in those very narrow areas. And finally, we get to the definition of economics from this point of view. I'm sure that everyone who is listening can recite this. Economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants. I've underlined the most important components of this definition: allocation. So it's about allocating resources. The resources are scarce and our wants are unlimited. And that, of course, creates the fundamental economic problem. The usual orthodox textbook will have chapter 2 with a title of The Economic Problem. The problem is that resources are scarce, but wants are unlimited. Therefore, we cannot satisfy all of the wants. The non-orthodox or heterodox Keynesian institutionalist, and much of what I say is going to apply to the Marxist approach too, is very different. It starts from the presumption that there's no such thing as a natural human behavior. Human behavior is shaped by institutions, culture, society. Behavior is largely socially determined. Culture matters. People behave differently depending on the culture in which they've been brought up. Many or most decisions are not rational in the neoclassical sense of the term. Again, they are largely socially determined according to your culture. That will influence your decision-making process greatly. But the more important problem is that we face fundamental existential uncertainty. We never know if the decision that we're making is the best. Even after the fact, we can't determine what would have been the best decision. A lot of the decisions we make, we live to regret because we could not know the outcome of that decision. These traditions also reject this notion of marginal productivity determining your share of output. Power, discrimination, prejudice, segregation, all of these things matter and go into determining what your share of output will be. There is nothing natural about the distribution. There's nothing natural about prices or about wages. These things are all determined within society, a lot of them very complexly, but the point is they're not natural. There's no reason why we need to accept the existing distribution or the existing wage or the existing prices. There is a role for the government to play and society itself, government and also institutions to play in altering that distribution if we don't like it. So there is a significant role for government. It goes way beyond coming in when there's a market failure. Okay, finally, a definition that I would propose that I think most heterodox economists would accept is that economics is the study of the social creation and social distribution of society's resources. You note there is a fundamental difference in the definition here. Resources aren't given, they are socially created. The distribution is also social. We decide what the distribution will be. There's nothing here about unlimited wants. Wants are largely manufactured. And there's nothing here about resources being scarce. Resources are not scarce. They're created socially. If we want more, we can create more. Now, I will put a footnote here. Of course, the gifts of nature are limited, and we have pretty much exhausted those. That is a big problem. I'm not ignoring that when I say that resources are not scarce. Natural resources are limited, and the ability of our natural environment to replicate itself is in great danger. But most of the resources that we need are human resources, and we can always create more of those if we need them. Okay, let's turn to then the formal models. First, I will do what Keynes called classical, what we call neoclassical, and this is very confusing, unfortunately. I wish Keynes had called it the neoclassical school. It has nothing to do with the classical school that runs from Smith through Ricardo to Karl Marx. What Keynes is referring to as classical starts with Smith through Ricardo, but then it goes to Jevons, Walras, Menger in the 1870s. So let's look at the model in detail. Okay, we begin with a labor market. It's very important to point this out. Everything begins with the labor market. So we have a demand for labor that is a function of the marginal product of labor. So there's a relationship between labor demand and the real wage. It's a negative relationship. It's downward sloping. Firms will pay a real wage equal to the marginal product of labor, the contribution of labor to the production process. Downward sloping because as we increase the quantity of labor, its marginal productivity goes down. Then we have a labor supply curve that's derived from the individual's income leisure trade-off. We assume here, and that's important, that it's a positive relationship. That as the wage goes up, we will provide more labor. There's actually a income effect and a substitution effect, but we assume that the substitution effect dominates. And so the labor market equilibrium is determined by the intersection of these two curves. That determines the real wage. And by definition, it is the full employment level. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Randall,
Yes.
can you go back to the last slide? Sorry.
Can we just have a summary? Because there's some students here who don't study economics. So I want to cater to everyone. So if you could go back on the diagram and explain it one more time.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, for
So
people who haven't got.
The reason it slopes downwards, what would be the explanation for that?
Well, as the quantity of labor increases, its marginal productivity goes down. This is assumed for all factors of production. You hire the most productive ones first, and as you add more and more of any of the factors of production, you're bringing into the production process less productive units.
Right. So basically what it means, let's say you have an oven and you keep adding workers to it. Eventually each additional worker will become less and less productive. That's what the assumption is, essentially.
Yes.
And that creates the demand for labor. So in order to hire more labor, you only want to give them a lower wage to compensate for the lower productivity.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've hired all the college educated workers I can get, okay, the most productive ones. So they would be at the upper end of that labor demand curve. And now I've exhausted that. So now I've got to hire the high school graduates and then on down. So I'm hiring the most productive ones first.
Right. And as for the upward sloping labor supply curve, the reason it's upward sloping is that because at higher and higher wages, leisure time becomes more costly because you have to give up the wage you could have earned. Yes. Which is why you're willing to supply more and more labor.
Yeah. So you'll work more, each individual will work more hours if the wage is higher. Now, we know that empirically, it seems that labor supply curve bends backwards. So it actually, when wages get high enough, there's an income effect. And people will start enjoying more leisure and less work at a high enough wage. I mean, just imagine if you got $1 million an hour, you probably are not going to work 8 hours a day. So, but we assume that away because that would create problems of finding our point of equilibrium.
Okay. So does everyone understand so far? Okay, we'll continue now.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Production function. Output. One thing I better say, as we go through this until we get to the final slide on the neoclassical approach, all of this stuff is in real terms. Okay, so it was a real wage in this picture. Nominal wage divided by the price level is the real wage. This is labor measured, its contribution is measured in real terms. How many widgets? Widget is sort of the generic product that economists use. How many widgets per hour of labor do you get? So it's all in real terms. And when we do the production function, output here, Y, is also measured in real terms. So it's real output. Not the money value, it's the real output. That's a function of the quantity of labor. You can think of it as the total labor hours that are worked, and the quantity of capital, for K for capital. That is also real capital. So it's real physical machines and so on. Now, in the simple models, we don't have technology in there. So output goes up only because either we have more labor or we have more capital. We can put technological progress into this model. I'm not going to do it. We can represent it as the A term here. So we could get more output with the same amount of labor and capital if the technology is better. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that more deeply. I just want to say that it is taken account of, okay, in the more complex model. Okay, we assume diminishing returns, and what that means is as we add more labor to a fixed quantity of capital, output rises, but at a declining rate. And anyone who had calculus, you can imagine what that looks like in terms of calculus. If you haven't, don't worry, it doesn't matter. And beyond some point, it will actually stop rising. Output will stop rising. It might even fall. Okay, how can we explain that? Imagine we only have one machine and one worker. Can produce, say, 10 widgets a day. We add a second worker, and with two workers, maybe we can get 19 widgets out of that machine. Okay, so that second worker only added 9. We add a third worker to the machine, and how could you get more? Well, because if one worker takes a break, you still have a worker at the machine. Okay, we add a third worker. Maybe output will go up a bit, but maybe it's only 7 or 8 for that third worker, and on and on. Finally, we get to the point where we're adding the 10th, 11th, 12th worker to the machine, and they start to get in each other's way, and output actually declines. Okay, so that's a very simple explanation of why that might be true. It's a very important assumption, though. All right, the firm will hire labor up to the point where the real wage equals the marginal product of labor. We already showed that in the labor market. Equilibrium output has to be at the full employment. Y sub F is the full employment level of output. It's easier to show this in the diagram in order to explain it. All we're doing is we're beginning with the labor market, just like before. Our labor demand curve, exactly the same. Our labor supply curve, the same. Equilibrium, real wage, the same. And full employment. Why is it full employment? Because the two curves intersect at this point. At this real wage, anyone who wants to work has a job. Does that mean everybody's working? No, it doesn't. There are people who aren't willing to work at this rate, at this real wage. We say their reservation wage is higher than this. Okay, where are they? They're on the labor supply curve, but they're up here. They're above that real wage. If the real wage were higher, more of them would want to work. But firms aren't willing to pay that. That's above the labor demand curve. So we can't reach those points unless the marginal product of labor increases. Okay, so this is full employment, really by definition. As long as the wage is flexible, you have to get full employment. Okay, here is our total amount produced on this axis, the y-axis, and here is the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis. We already know how much labor is employed because that's determined in the labor market. So we can draw a dotted line straight down. That is the full employment level. And then the production function here tells us with that much labor, how much output can we produce? Well, it's that much. Y sub F, again, the F stands for the full employment level of production. Now there's a note here. When we draw this output curve, our production function, it is drawn given the quantity of capital we have. If we had more capital, the curve could be higher up, and we would have a higher level of output. for that amount of employment. If the amount of capital was less, the curve would be lower. It would be down here. And with that amount of employment, we would get less output. But given capital, and given the quantity of labor determined in the labor market, YF is the best we can do. Okay, so we end up at that point. That's how much output we have. So these are two markets, the labor market and the total product market. That's how much we can produce. We need to move on to the third.
Oh, excuse me.
Yep.
Can we just go over that again?
Yeah, just want to make sure that everyone can keep up. So the reason that the neoclassical model assumes that there's always full employment, they don't believe in unemployment as long as wages are flexible. So there's no like trade union keeping wages artificially high. They think that if you want to be employed, just offer a lower wage and then the employer will hire you. So everyone can be employed if they want to, provided wages are flexible. Yeah.
As long as they're willing to work for the equilibrium wage, they are working. So there is no involuntary unemployment. Is there voluntary unemployment? Yes. There are people who say, I'm not going to work for that wage. Okay. So they're not really a concern of us because they are choosing not to work. They're maximizing their utility by taking leisure time. They would rather have leisure than work at that wage. So that's the definition of unemployment. Okay.
And one more thing. Marginal product theory says that the wage you earn is what you basically deserve because you get remunerated with your productivity. So all the extra stuff you produce is what your wages basically equal to, right?
Yes. Right. That's your contribution to the production process.
Yeah,
so you deserve it in the sense that you contributed that much to production.
Yeah, so basically, if you have a low wage, it's because you're not productive.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. The third market is where the interest rate is determined. This is based on loanable funds theory. And this is an important component in neoclassical theory. It's also sort of, the conventional view that the average person will have, whether they ever studied economics. This is going to be familiar, I think, to everybody. The idea is that the supply of loanable funds comes from savers. You save your money, and you save it in a bank, and then the bank can lend it out to investors. So we have a saving supply. That's a function of your thriftiness and the interest rate. Okay, your thriftiness. Neoclassical economics doesn't try to explain this. It varies across people. It varies across societies. Japanese are very thrifty. The British and Americans are not thrifty. Is it genetics? We don't know. We don't know what determines it. But we assume that in order to get you to save instead of consume, we have to pay you interest. You wouldn't do it without interest. So it's a combination of thriftiness plus the interest rate. And how thrifty you are. If you're really thrifty, it doesn't take much of an interest rate to get you to save. If you're not very thrifty, we would have to pay you a lot of interest to get you to save. Then we have, and it's upward sloping. The higher the interest rate, the more saving we will get. Okay, so it's a function of thrift. The interest rate is on the vertical, investment and saving are on the horizontal. Okay, we also have an investment demand curve. Here, the demand for investment is a function of the marginal product of capital, which we already looked at, and the interest rate. Okay, so the investors in capital equipment are going to consider and actually weigh the marginal product of capital against the interest rate. If the marginal product of capital is greater than the costs of borrowing to finance the purchase, then we will buy the capital. If the marginal product of capital is less than the interest rate, it's not worth it. Okay, we're not going to get a good enough return in order to justify the interest rate. Now, remember, everything here is in real terms. This is a real interest rate, and this is a real marginal product of capital. How many widgets can the machine produce? That is downward sloping. Intersection of the two curves determines the equilibrium interest rate. Oops, I'll get to that in just a second. The equilibrium interest rate and the equilibrium quantities of investment and saving. So at that interest rate, we have just the right amount of saving to finance all the loans to the investors that are buying capital equipment. So this is the point of equilibrium. This is where the quantity of investment and the quantity of saving is determined in the loanable funds market. This is where the interest rate is determined in the loanable funds market. And this is the real interest rate, so you can think of this as being the nominal rate that is quoted on your loan. Say the loan nominal rate that you're going to pay is 6%, less the inflation rate. If the inflation rate is 2% and you're paying 6% nominal, the real interest rate is 4%, 6 minus 2. All right. In just a minute, I'm going to get to the nominal stuff. But so far, everything is in real terms. So this is an equilibrium real interest rate. I put an asterisk here that this upward sloping saving supply curve is assuming a positive rate of time preference, which I had already stated it, but I didn't use the technical term, rate of time preference. That is, we have to pay you a higher interest rate in order to get you to save more. Okay, this doesn't come from any empirical research. It doesn't come from any evidence whatsoever. It is just assumed to get us an upward sloping saving supply curve. Okay, any questions on this?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So, basic terminology. So what we got here is the market for money. So what they're assuming, the neoclassicals, is the banks take your money, they take your savings, and they loan that out. That's false. But what they say is that as you supply more and more money, the interest rate is driven downwards, right? So if there's a big supply of something, interest rate goes down. If there's little supply, interest rates are higher to ration that limited supply of money out. And at lower and lower interest rates, the demand for loans or investment increases because now you have to pay back a lot less. But at higher and higher interest rates, savings increases, which banks use to loan out. So at the equilibrium interest rate, savings and investments are equal. Loans and the money supply is equal. So all the money that you save is loaned out because the interest rate adjusts the prices to make it profitable for investors to invest.
Yeah, just one correction. Don't use the term money. There's no money here. We haven't done money yet.
Right,
So
right.
It's not money, it's saving, okay? This is not the intersection of a supply of money and a demand for money. It's a supply of saving and a demand for saving. Okay, so I know it's strange to imagine, well, in what form is this saving? Okay, but it's important to distinguish saving from money. And for the people who've had more economics, One is a stock and one is a flow. This is a flow. Saving is a flow. Investment is a flow. This market is about flows, not stocks. Okay. If you don't know what I'm talking about, completely ignore that. I'm going to get to money really soon. Okay. First, I just wanted to show you a couple of things.
One moment. By equilibrium, on the last slide, you mean the equilibrium between savings and interest, right?
Saving and investment are in equilibrium at the equilibrium interest rate, which is R sub E. So investment equals saving. Investment equals saving only at this interest rate. So as long as the interest rate is flexible, we will achieve equilibrium. Investment equals saving. Just like in the labor market, as long as the wage is flexible, we will achieve equilibrium, where labor demand equals labor supply.
Thank you.
The interest rate is a price, just like wage is a price. Wage is the price of labor. The interest rate is the price of loanable funds.
Yeah, we got a question in the audience.
Sorry, are we assuming that we have a closed economy?
That we have a what?
A closed economy, because we don't.
Well, yeah, we're not going to get into the external sector. In fact, in the whole lecture I'm going to give, we can assume a closed economy. That will be fine. A couple of times I'll mention the adjustment we would make with if there are net exports or net imports. But for the most part, yes. Okay. Neoclassical interest rate theory, then we can see what happens, say, if the supply of savings increases. That would be, for example, because suddenly we wake up tomorrow morning and everyone is thriftier than they were. So the British and Americans became more like Japanese. And for 40 years, our policymakers have been telling us we should be more thrifty. We should act more like the Japanese and save more, because then we would get more investment. Okay, well, what do they have in their mind? This is exactly it. An increase of the saving supply shifts the saving curve out to S1, and that lowers the interest rate. And so we end up with a higher level of investment. Our new equilibrium is with a lower interest rate, more saving and more investment. The equilibrium level now is I1 and S1. Okay, so this is how an increase of national thriftiness leads to an increase of investment, because the interest rate will be pushed down. We could do the reverse. I don't have the picture, but what if we wake up tomorrow and we're less thrifty? The curve shifts to the left, the interest rate goes up, we get less investment, which for the long run means our economic growth will be lower. If we're thriftier, we save more, economic growth will be higher because we're going to get more machines. Okay. What about the investment curve? A change of the marginal product of capital, or our expectations of the profits we'll get if we invest, will shift the demand curve. I can't remember which way I did it. Okay, I increased it. So for some reason, firms are more optimistic about the future, or we have advances in our machines that we're producing. The marginal product of capital increases. That'll shift the investment curve up, and that will allow us to invest more. That given a supply curve, we will move up the supply curve until we reach the point where investment equals saving again, but at a new higher level of interest rate. Now, at the higher interest rate, people are willing to save more. Okay, that's why the saving supply curve slopes up. The only reason the firms are investing more with a higher interest rate is because capital has become more productive. Okay, that's why the investment demand curve shifted up. If capital wasn't more productive, if we didn't expect more profits from capital, then we wouldn't pay that higher interest rate. Okay, is that clear? I'm going to do one more because this is always a policy discussion. Okay, interest rate going up. What about government deficits? Okay, well, that's another demand for loanable funds, and that is what is supposed to be crowding out. So there's this fear that if the government spends more than its taxes, that is a deficit. The government has to finance its deficit by borrowing. It's going to compete with private firms for the supply of loanable funds. That's going to push up the interest rate, and that will reduce investment. So let's see how that works in the picture. So now our savings supply curve is equal to, in equilibrium, investment demand. So that's the demand by firms for loanable funds, but also there's a government demand for loanable funds, which is government spending minus taxes. By definition, that's what a deficit is. If government spending, G, is greater than tax revenue, we call that a deficit. And in neoclassical theory, you have to finance that by borrowing. So the
sorry, by loanable funds, you mean the money they're borrowing from? Oh, not money. What do you mean?
Future consumption, basically. They say if you don't consume now, you plan to consume in the future.
Yeah, they're borrowing savings. Okay, not money. They're borrowing savings. So not only are firms borrowing savings, now the government is borrowing savings too. So the curve will be out to the right. So here is, we didn't change investment. So investment is still I0. But what we did was we added the government's deficit. So the distance between these two curves, I know they're lines, we always say curves, is the amount of the deficit. So that's how much the government is borrowing, how much of the savings the government is borrowing to finance its deficit. Since we have a new intersection, we know that the interest rate has gone up. So the government competing with the private firms has pushed the interest rate up. Okay. And we end up at a new equilibrium interest rate of R1. And now saving equals investment plus the deficit. So the saving is split between firms and government. They're borrowing it. Now, let me just show you. What we mean by crowding out. So I've reproduced the previous picture. We have moved to a new equilibrium. It's not obvious how much investment has changed because we still have the same investment demand curve, I0, and we added to that the deficit. We know the government is borrowing some saving. What had to happen to the consumers and firms because of the government's borrowing? Well, investment has gone down. We know that because the interest rate's higher. We didn't change the marginal product of capital. So if the interest rate goes up, we know that investment must have declined. How much did it decline? It declined by this amount, okay? If you haven't had econ, you haven't done these shifts before, you'll just have to take my word for it. We can measure how much it is. It is that amount. okay? But at the same time, consumption has gone down. Now, why do we know consumption has gone down? Because saving increased. We moved from this point up to this point, so we're higher on the saving curve. We know saving has gone up. That means by definition that households are consuming less because they either consume or save. If they are saving more, they consume less. So the government deficit not only leads to less investment, it also leads to less consumption, okay? Total amount of output won't change. What happens is that output goes to the government, households consume less output, and firms purchase less capital equipment. So this is why deficits are supposed to be bad. They reduce the private sector's use of resources. They're shifted to the government. And we end up with a higher interest rate. So those are the bad effects of government deficits. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does everyone follow so far? Does anyone have any questions?
I thought they feel the deficits from international people coming in and borrowing money.
Oh, Randall, did you have a question?
Something about international and modern money.
I think he's asking government deficits are financed by international foreign currencies.
No. Government deficits are not financed by foreign currency. They're also not financed by saving. So modern money theory rejects everything here in this picture. It's completely wrong. But I'll get to that because so does Keynes. Okay, so modern money theory's view is the same as Keynes's. This is completely wrong-headed, but I'm just presenting it. This is the way most people think.
Can I make a point? Last week we had Warren Mosler on Zoom as well, and we mentioned that post-Keynesianism should be taught in the curriculum. Well, he took issue with that. He said that post-Keynesians get it wrong too. In regards to the source of the price level and various other aspects of government finance, that they tax liabilities, create unemployment, and all of that. So I was curious. Maybe we should leave that to the end. Okay, I'll just leave that hanging.
Yeah, we're not going to have time for that. But there are some post-Keynesians and there are some topics on which there is confusion over saving. But there's no difference between Keynes's views on saving and modern money theory's views on saving. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting Keynes's model, but modern money theory adopts Keynes's model. And this isn't controversial because Bill and I wrote the textbook that incorporates Keynes and modern money theory. Okay. Now on other topics, yes, post-Keynesians get some things wrong. Okay. And it's hard for us to know what Keynes would think about some of the things MMT says. We don't know the answer to that. All right. I already said that. Okay. Now until we'll do this and then we'll do money and then we'll move on to Keynes. Okay. So there's been this long tradition in neoclassical thought. It goes back to Say that supply creates its own demand. And that's going to be true in this model that we just went through. And what it means is that when you produce output, you will create an equivalent amount of income, okay? And that income will create an equivalent amount of demand. there's never a possibility of having insufficient demand. Supply creates its own demand, okay? Why is that? Well, because when we're producing, we're using the factors of production, labor, capital, and land, that is natural resources. And each one of those gets a return based on its marginal product. We did marginal product of capital, we did marginal product of labor. We can add in natural resources, and there's a marginal product of land. The owners of land will get a return based on the contribution to production too. So we know that income has been created when we were producing, and it is equal to the contribution to production. So there is enough income out there to purchase all of the output. And the assumptions that we have in this model ensure that all of the income will be spent, okay? Consumers will consume a portion of their income, and then they save a portion, but that their saving finances the investment. So it gets spent too on capital equipment. There's no possibility that you produce stuff that you can't sell at the aggregate level. So it's very much like barter. The act of supplying one good implies a demand for another good. If you're Robinson Crusoe and you're trading with Friday and you've got bananas and he's got coconuts, by definition, if you're supplying your bananas and he accepts it, he's got to give you a coconut. He demands, you demand another good. Money is, if money is used, it's only a medium of exchange. And we're going to introduce money in just a second. There are strong and weak versions of Say's law. The strong version is the supply creates its own demand, and it must be the full employment level of supply and demand. Okay, the model I just presented guarantees that's true. You're always at full employment. There is a weak version. I didn't do it, but the weak version would say supply always equals demand, but you're not necessarily at full employment. But that can't happen if wages are flexible. If you had a minimum wage law, or someone mentioned labor unions, you might not have full employment, but Say's law would still hold, okay? Let's introduce money. And it's the quantity theory of money that is used in the neoclassical model. I'll do the income version. There's another version too, but we won't do it. The transaction version. MV equals PY. M stands for the money supply. V stands for velocity. P stands for the overall price level, and Y again stands for real output. So P times Y is what today we call nominal GDP. Back when Keynes was debating the classical economists, we didn't have a measure of GDP, but now we do. And the P times Y is nominal GDP. This is the overall price level. It's not the price of an individual good. It's the overall price level times the total amount of production in the economy equals the money supply times velocity. Now, money supply, you have some idea of what that is. That could be cash plus demand deposits, that is checking accounts at the bank. Velocity is, we can say, the number of times the currency or checks change hands over the course of the period. So we're talking about GDP for the year, total output for the year. We're talking about the number of times money exchanges hands over the course of the year. Okay, so that's in words, the definition. In practice, it's very hard to trace the number of times a dollar bill or a pound note. It changes hands every time, but it's easy to calculate because if we take nominal GDP and divide by the money supply measured at a point in time, we get velocity. Okay, so it falls out of this identity. Okay, and the normal assumption is that the total output is determined in the model I just presented. Okay, so we can take it as given because it's been determined already. We assume that velocity also is taken as given. It's fixed somewhere else. Well, what fixes it? We could say payment habits and the degree of technology used in the payment system. So just as an example, the creation of ATM machines, automatic tellers, reduced the amount of money you had to hold in order to make transactions, and that increased the velocity of money. Okay. Anyway, if V is very stable at the extreme fixed, and if the output is determined as in the model, so it's fixed for a given period, tends to grow over time, then we can say that the quantity of money M determines the price level. An increase in the quantity of money will increase the price level. Even if you'd never seen the equation of exchange, you probably already had heard that money, too much money causes inflation. Okay, and it's based on this quantity equation that money determines prices, and if the money supply is growing fast, then prices will be growing fast, and that's what inflation is. So money determines prices, too much money causes inflation, is the conventional wisdom, and it's based on the quantity theory of money. All right. So now we can finish the model.
Before we continue, can you please define the price level?
Well, it's we sort of do it the other way around. When we calculate GDP, say for 2022, what we do is we take the sales price of every good or service sold over the course of the year, and we add those up to get nominal GDP. To determine real GDP, we get a measure of prices relative to a base year, and we deflate nominal GDP by the overall price deflator to get real GDP. So we actually do it the reverse way, but we can think of the overall price level as being some kind of an index of prices relative to a base year. The one that everyone has heard of is the Consumer Price Index, which is sort of an aggregate price level, and we use that to see how much prices have changed relative to a previous year. Okay.
And the nominal GDP is what?
Well, nominal GDP is, what we actually observe. If we take every transaction in goods and services, everything that was sold and bought over the course of the year, it will be price times quantity, P times Y. So nominal GDP is what we measure. and then to get the real GDP, we deflate it. But conceptually, what we're trying to do is say that, okay, we have 100 widgets were produced. What price did they sell at? And we multiply that price times the number, and we get nominal GDP. Our problem in the real world is we not only produce widgets, we produce thousands and thousands of different kinds of things. And so we can't just add up the quantities. If we only produced one thing, we could add up the quantities, find out the price, multiply price times the quantity, get nominal GDP. But in the real world, we have a wide variety of quantities of things that we can't just add up quantity.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. This just puts everything together so you can see. We start in the labor market. So all of these curves are the same as before, except unfortunately, here I have a Q instead of a Y. Otherwise, it's all the same. The Q is the same as the Y. Okay. So we have our labor market, which determines employment. We apply employment to our production function. That gives us output. Loanable funds finds the interest rate and the quantity of investment and the quantity of saving. And then finally, this picture here is for people who have microeconomics. It's sort of like a budget constraint. It shows you the division of output between consumption and investment. We have two kinds of output. We have consumer goods, consumption, and we have investment goods that are the capital equipment that firms are buying. And this tells us how much investment there is and how much consumption there is. So this tells us the split of output between consumption and investment. And that's determined in the loanable funds market because consumption is just the income that households did not save. Okay, if you don't get that part of it, it's not important. All right. Conclusions of the neoclassical model. Supply factors dominate in the model. I have not gone through all of these things, but real things are what determine the important outputs and conclusions. Technology is important because that goes into determining how productive labor and capital are. Population is important because that determines how many workers we can have. Tastes are important because we have a labor leisure decision and we have a consumption saving decision. Those are both determined by what we call tastes, preferences. Together, those things determine all the real variables. Real wages, real interest rates, the real amount of investment, the real amount of production. Nominal variables don't matter. Nominal variables are nominal GDP, nominal wage, nominal interest rate. We can determine what they are after we add money into the model, but they don't affect any of the outcomes. Okay, so the real wage is determined in the labor market. The nominal wage is just the price in money terms, but it doesn't affect any decisions. The production function and the labor market determine the real variables of employment and output. Saving and investment determine the real interest rate. Money only determines nominal variables. So the way that this is put is money is neutral. Money doesn't affect anything that's important. Demand doesn't matter for the real variables. It can affect nominal variables. It is assumes perfect competition, perfectly flexible wages, prices, I could add and interest rates and perfect information. Okay. Given all of those things, we get the model that I just went through.
Okay, I think we'll have a quick summary of that again. So I guess the classical or neoclassical model, it starts in the labor market, and that's where you get your full employment. Flexible wages will adjust, so if there's unemployment, wages will be driven down, you get full employment again. The loanable funds market ensures that all savings are invested, nobody sits on savings, something is being done with it. So that's why you have all output being at equilibrium. You don't get gluts, or you can always sell what you want to sell. Supply creates its own demand. That's Say's law. It assumes that all income is spent. And then the quantity theory of money says that if the money supply is increased, all that's going to do is drive up prices, you get inflation, because real stuff, real production and employment are all determined by market forces. We don't need any extra demand stimulus to improve that. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. So increasing the money supply is not going to increase output. It's not going to increase employment. All it does is raise nominal. Okay, so this is the model Keynes wrote his book against. Okay, and really Keynes is the one who put this model together. He had to do that because classical economics was sort of incoherent. So people were saying things, and so the way that Keynes put it is, well, if you believe that, this must be the model you're using, okay? And then this got incorporated in the textbooks, and what I just presented will be in every macroeconomics textbook, every mainstream one, okay? But really it was Keynes that put it all together for the classicals for the purpose of critiquing it, okay? So that's what the general theory is doing. What's wrong with it? All right. Keynes summarizes what he's going to do in chapter 1 of the general theory, and it's probably the shortest chapter ever written by an economist. It's barely 1 page long. He says, this book, note I'll just have a footnote. Note the title. The title of his book changed over time from something like The Monetary Theory of Production to The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. General theory is very important. Jamie Galbraith wrote a paper arguing that Keynes purposely was borrowing from Einstein. General theory of relativity, okay, Einstein did for physics what Keynes is going to do for economics. It's a general theory. Okay, so what's it about? The determination of the scale of output and employment as a whole. This is what we now call macroeconomics. Keynes created macroeconomics for the non-Marxist world. Neoclassical economics was not macro, okay? Keynes had already written a 2-volume masterpiece, The Treatise on Money, 1930. As he was finishing it, he wrote, as it was being published, he wrote to his friends that he was already dissatisfied with it. He already knew he had made a huge mistake in the treatise. And he set to work writing the general theory immediately because he had to rectify the problem. So in this preface, he tells us, in the intro, he tells us what was wrong. The treatise on money had taken that as given. In other words, it had no theory of output and employment as a whole. And then it worked out how forces might cause change to a profit disequilibrium, but didn't work out what determines the level of output. What he means here is that the treatise could explain, given output, what's the division between consumption and investment, for example, okay? Or what determines what kind of investment, which kind of machinery do you invest in? But there was no theory about what determined total output and total employment. He could only explain what shifts employment from one kind of firm to another kind of firm. All right. Second point, the classical full employment case, which is what we just went through, is just a special case of the general theory. It's a special case. The general case, which is what the general theory does, is one in which changing views about the future influence the level of employment and not simply where employment is directed. So he's going to have a theory about what determines total employment in the economy. His argument is that he didn't have it in the treaties, and it doesn't exist in the neoclassical theory, okay? That labor market that I showed you before is wrong, okay? Because that claims to demonstrate that you're at full employment. He's going to argue that is not correct, okay? And then finally, not only is the classical case just special, it's dangerous. If applied to the facts of experience, what he means is, if you try to formulate policy based on that model, it will be dangerous. And remember, he's writing in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and what he meant was your policies based on that model will make unemployment worse, not better. And we all, in the United States, I don't know the UK, United States, the unemployment rate was 25%. And so if we applied the neoclassical model, which says flexible wages will reduce unemployment, the solution should have been lowering wages. And Keynes is saying that's dangerous. It will make unemployment worse, not better. Okay, he starts off in chapter 2 criticizing the neoclassical labor market. Okay, all I've done is use his explication, but you can see the picture is exactly the same. Okay, he says he calls it postulates, we could say assumptions. The assumption is that the wage equals the marginal product of labor, which means you're on the labor demand curve, and wage equals the marginal disutility of working. This is his term for the labor leisure decision. We have to compensate you for giving up leisure. Working gives you disutility, negative utility. Wages give you positive utility, okay? So you have to have some disutility in order to get work, in order to get wages. That means you're on the labor supply curve, okay? So this is just their model. Then he's going to go on to say, I'm willing to accept one of those postulates for the sake of argument, but not the second. So he rejects the second postulate. He says, I will accept we're on the labor demand curve, but we're not necessarily on the labor supply curve. What that means is that any part of, we could be anywhere on the red part of the labor demand curve, okay? And any point above where they intersect would be a point of unemployment, because say at the level that I chose here, the labor demand is right there, the labor supply is over there. All the people who are willing to work at that wage, this distance here, are officially unemployed. They want jobs, but they can't get them, okay? So the neoclassicals say, well, the solution is easy. They will just negotiate for lower wages and they'll get jobs. And Keynes provides a couple of real world observations to cast doubt on that. I personally think this was a mistake. Keynes shouldn't have done this. I could talk a long time about this, but I won't. He should not have accepted the labor demand curve. at all, and he shouldn't have relied on real world observations, because what he needed was a theoretical argument. And we'll get to that in just 1 second, because he has a strong theoretical argument. He didn't need to do this. But he says, workers care about their relative wage, not the real wage. Remember, this is a real wage. It's, we would say, the inflation adjusted nominal wage. But he says that is not the basis of their decision making. He has two arguments. One, workers will resist a nominal wage cut. So if you're earning $10 an hour and the firm says, you know, we're going to have to lower your wage to $8 an hour, they will fight against that. Okay, maybe go on strike, maybe quit, walk off the job and go look for another one. But he says, but if their real wage goes down because there's inflation, they don't walk off the job. Okay, and this pretty much does fit empirical observation. So what he's saying is that it's not really the real wage that they're looking at. They do care about their relative wage relative to other people's wages. If I'm working in a firm and we're all making $10 an hour and the employer says, I'm going to lower your wage to $8, I'm going to be very mad, because relative to the others, my wage is lower. On the other hand, if your wage is driven down in real terms because there's inflation, you don't walk off the job. His second argument is workers can't bargain over the real wage anyway. Their contracts are all nominal wages. They don't even know what the inflation rate will be when they sign the contract. Okay? Now, at the time he's writing, we generally did not have CPI adjusted contracts. Okay, so what he was arguing was true. Today, you can try to get a CPI, inflation adjustment in your labor contract. That's a way to deal with this problem. Okay, but anyway, as I said, these aren't very convincing. Okay, to beat a theory, you have to have a better theory. Empirical observation never changes any economist's mind. I think I can say that very strongly. It never changes their mind. Just because your theory doesn't work in practice doesn't make you change your theory, okay? He goes on, okay, so now let's get to the theory. First, he had to define what he meant by unemployment, okay? And he's only worried about involuntary unemployment, where people want to work, but they, even at the going wage, but they can't get a job offer. So he says, let's define it as if a small increase of the price of wage goods, so these are consumer goods, the kinds of goods people buy using their wages, at the existing nominal wage, and I put in parentheses here, that lowers the real wage, because if the prices are going up, but your wage isn't, then your real wage is less. You can buy less of the output. If that leads to more employment, then there must have been involuntary unemployment. What he means is that we were on the labor demand curve, but not the labor supply. So just real quickly, if we were at a point like this, but inflation lowered the real wage, firms would increase employment. That's proof there was unemployment, okay? Then he restates it. And this is the kicker, this is the important argument. If aggregate demand rises and that increases employment, then there had to be involuntary unemployment. If aggregate demand in the economy as a whole goes up and people get jobs, that must mean they were involuntarily unemployed. The problem was there weren't enough jobs, okay? So the problem was aggregate demand wasn't high enough. Now that's the point he's going to make in the general theory. employment is not actually determined in the labor market. Employment is determined by aggregate demand.
Sorry, by aggregate demand, you mean the demand that employers have for.
It's a collective demand in the entire economy, just all aggregated together.
Okay.
In the entire economy. Okay. Let me give you I didn't write it down, sorry, but a 1-sentence summary of the general theory. Firms hire the amount of employment they think they need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. I'll repeat it. Firms hire the amount of employment they think they need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. So it's not determined in the labor market. Okay, it's not determined by the intersection of labor supply and labor demand. It's determined by firms' expectations of their sales. If they think sales are going to be higher, then they will increase employment. If they don't expect sales to be higher, they won't increase employment. And it will not matter if wages go down. They're not going to hire workers to produce output they can't sell. They'll only hire workers to produce output they think they can sell. So the wage falling doesn't help. And Keynes is going to argue the wage falling actually can hurt. Why? Because if the wage is falling, workers' income is falling, their purchases are probably going to fall. So falling wages will likely reduce employment because firms will expect to sell less if wages are falling. That's exactly what was happening in the Great Depression. The falling wages were depressing aggregate demand, and so firms wouldn't hire workers, even if they could hire them at lower wages. Okay? So Keynes proposes a principle of effective demand, okay? And this is what he's known for, what the general theory is known for, a theory of effective demand. So instead of starting with the labor market, we start with an aggregate supply and an aggregate demand for output as a whole. So this is looking at the economy as a whole. And our aggregate supply, he calls it aggregate supply price curve, and labels it a Z curve, is the expected proceeds required to induce entrepreneurs, capitalists, to supply that level of output. So firms expect proceeds based on, employ workers based on what they think they can get. Okay, and on the supply side, we are looking at how high would the revenues have to be to get them to employ some number of workers. That's the supply side. The demand side is the proceeds we would expect to get given that level of employment. So this is the demand side of the economy. D. I'll come back to the words here. We have a picture that shows what he's talking about. Keynes didn't draw a picture. There's only one graph in the whole general theory. He doesn't graph this, but this is what he describes. On this axis, we have firms' expected sales revenue and their planned expenditures. On the horizontal axis, we have employment. And keep in mind, this is the aggregate. So this is aggregate employment for the economy as a whole. Our supply curve, the Z curve, is upward sloping. And what it tells us is that in order to get firms to hire more workers, they have to they would have to receive more revenue. That's why it slopes up. Okay. The demand curve shows how much revenue they expect they will get for each level of employment. So the Z curve is how much they have to get to induce them to employ. The D curve is how much they think they will get from employing. What if we were to the left of the intersection, the point A? If we're to the left, you can see the D curve is higher than the Z. What that means is that we expect revenue to be higher than the amount of revenue we would need to make it worthwhile to hire that level of employment. So the revenues are greater than what we require. So it makes sense to employ more workers. As we move along, the gap between those two gets smaller until we get to the point where they cross. Okay? To the right of this point, the amount we need to get is greater than the amount we expect to get. So it would not be profitable to employ more workers. So any point to the left, it always makes sense to increase employment. Any point to the right, it makes sense to reduce employment. So point A is the point of equilibrium, where the amount we expect to get is the amount we would need to get to induce us to employ that amount. So that's equilibrium. We're hiring just the right number of workers to get the amount of revenue we expect to get, to cover our costs and to produce a profit. So that's why point A is equilibrium. Okay, so if the D is above the Z, there's an incentive to increase employment. If D is below the Z, incentive to reduce employment. Okay, classicals, he says, assume that the D equals Z, or the demand equals supply, for every level of employment. Anytime Z rises, supply rises, D will rise. We already saw this. That is Say's law. Supply creates its own demand. Any Z must have an effective demand associated with it. There's no possible problem of effective demand because supply creates its own demand. Keynes says that where D equals Z, okay, Say's law will hold, but it's only one point, okay, at the point of effective demand, where D equals Z. There's only one point at which it's true. The supply equals demand. That's the equilibrium point. That is the point of effective demand. That is what determines the level of employment. And there's no reason to believe that's full employment. When we do this picture, we find out what employment's going to be without reference to the labor market. So unlike the classical model, Keynes doesn't begin with the labor market because employment is not determined in the labor market. Employment is determined by the point of effective demand. It's determined in this picture. It's determined by firms hiring the amount of labor they think they need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. That is point A. Okay, so I'll stop. This is the main contribution of the general theory, the theory of effective demand.
Right. So if you want to try to summarize this, the Z curve represents the amount of revenues or proceeds that the firm needs to get in order to hire a certain amount of workers. Also, D curve is the amount of revenue that the firm needs, no, but the firm is expecting to actually get. So if it's expecting more than it needs, then it will increase employment until that's not the case anymore. Then what it needs is greater than what it actually gets. Would that summarize it?
That's right. And so, once we've got this, now we know what employment is. Keynes is going to make the argument that, not only should we not expect this to be full employment level, there are reasons why it usually will not be. So rather than the free market leading to full employment, the free market is very unlikely to go to full employment. So it's not enough to just say there's no guarantee that's full employment. Keynes wants to make a stronger argument that left to its own devices, the capitalist system will usually not have full employment. Okay, that is a bit harder argument to make. And unfortunately, the theory is pretty complex. I'm not sure how much of it we're going to be able to go through. For one thing, it's taken a long time to get to this point, but another is it is pretty complex. But the short answer is that it's because we live in a monetary economy. And what Keynes is going to argue is that money has these special characteristics that that cause it to be the barrier to reaching full employment. The special characteristics of money prevent the market from moving us to full employment. If we had an economy that didn't use money, that wasn't organized in the way the capitalist economy is organized, in other words, was not profit-based, we could have full employment. But because capitalism is a system, a monetary system, that's based on trying to get money profits, we're usually not going to get to full employment. And then he will have some policy recommendations for what we can try to do in order to maintain higher levels of employment. And I see this as being consistent with the MMT view that it's the monetary system, and it is a policy failure to that leads us to live with unemployment. Keynes has policies to try to promote employment. He didn't have the notion of a job guarantee, but he did see a role for the government to play in trying to increase employment. And one of his most famous quotes is, if the, here I'm paraphrasing though, if the policymakers are so stupid, they can't think of a better way to employ labor, hire workers to dig holes to bury money, and then let other workers try to discover that money and dig it back up. He said, if you can't find a better way to employ people, at least that one would put people to work. Okay. We think, of course, a job guarantee is a lot better than that. Why waste the labor? Let's put people to work doing useful things. So I think it's perfectly consistent with what Keynes was arguing, although he didn't have a formal job guarantee program. Okay. Yep, go ahead.
is it money that prevents full employment or the profit motive? Because there's a distinction between them.
Well, but see, the profit is in money terms. If other kinds of societies that are, Paul Davidson, who's a famous post-Keynesian, would always say, you never find unemployment in a nunnery. All the nuns are always fully employed. You never find unemployment in a tribal society. Okay, everyone is always fully employed. You never find unemployment in a feudal society. Everyone is always fully employed. You only find unemployment in capitalist economies. Why is that? Because it's a monetary production economy. You begin with money to produce output in order to end up with more money. This is Marx's MCM prime. Okay, it's because the purpose of production is not to produce output. The purpose of production is to produce money profits. That is the barrier. And Keynes is going to go through a very complicated argument as to why that barrier will prevent further production before you get to full employment. Okay, and it has to do with the special properties of money relative to other kinds of assets like capital equipment that prevent capital equipment from being produced because the return to money is greater than the expected return to capital equipment. That's why we end up with unemployment. And the natural market processes won't move us to full employment. Okay. So I think that the most critical part of this, which is chapter 17, we're not going to be able to do in any kind of detail. I'm going to try to give you some intuition for what Keynes was doing, but to really understand this, you need to get deeper into our textbook or into Keynes's general theory. And for the people who really want to pursue this, you have to read chapter 17 of the general theory. Almost all economists skip this. And so, you know, I was supposed to talk about post-Keynesians versus the classicals. And what a branch of post-Keynesians did, Paul Davidson, Hyman Minsky, Jan Kregel, is that they went back to chapter 17 and understood and argued that chapter 17 is the key to Keynes's theory. It's been ignored by almost all economists, including all the people who call themselves Keynesians. They completely ignored this chapter. Many of them will say that, you know, they started to read it and they couldn't understand it, and so they completely ignore it. But it is where the main contributions of Keynes can be found. Okay. Let me do some simple stuff and then just quickly talk about what he was trying to do in chapter 17. Okay, so in that figure, when we drew the demand curve, demand has two kinds of demand. The first one he called D1, that is demand that's a function of income. D2 is a demand that's not a function of income. Okay, D1 is largely consumption. So if you think about it, most people's consumption is determined by their income for the most part. Okay, so your wages determine mostly what you consume. Of course, you can save part of your income, and also you can borrow to supplement your income. So it's not a strict one-to-one relationship, but generally, if your income goes up, your consumption is going to go up. D2 is largely investment, because investment doesn't depend on this year's income. If you're buying capital equipment, you're a firm, you are buying capital equipment based on your expectations of future revenues. So it's not necessarily the income this year, it's what you think your revenue will be in the future. Okay, so that is autonomous, not a function of income this period. Keynes argues that what happens is that the part that is a function of income is positively related to income, but it has a declining slope, which means that as your income goes up, your consumption goes up, but by a smaller and smaller amount as income gets greater and greater and greater. That opens up a demand gap. And this is why the Say's law doesn't hold. As consumption goes up, as income goes up, your demand for consumer goods does not rise as fast. That creates insufficient demand. That insufficient demand has to be filled by the D2 kinds of spending, which in Keynes's book, for the most part, is investment. But we could add government spending as another kind of autonomous spending. And we can add net exports. If we're a trade surplus country, foreign demand adds to our demand. So those also are autonomous and can help to fill demand gaps. So the idea is that Say's law doesn't hold, because as incomes go up, demand doesn't necessarily rise as fast. And that can prevent you from going to full employment. This stuff I'm gonna skip. As I said, Keynes doesn't begin with the labor market, and he argues that employment is not determined in the labor market. Employment is determined by the amount of labor that you are willing to hire based on your expectations of sales. Okay? And what that means is that there's no necessary reason why rising wages would lead to lower demand for labor, and falling wages would lead to higher demand for labor, because the demand for labor is a derived demand depending on what firms expect revenue to be versus what revenue they need to induce them to employ labor. And changing wages will cause both the D curve and the Z curve to shift. And this is going to be too complex to go through in detail, but it can be shown, and we show it in the textbook, that you can get labor demand curves that slope up, which would be the opposite of what neoclassical theory believes, slope down, which is what neoclassical theory believes, or are vertical, okay? Which means that changing the wage has no impact on the demand for labor at all. If it slopes up, it means raising wages actually increases the demand for labor. Now, how could that possibly be true? Well, intuitively, raising wages increases income, which increases consumption, which increases the need for workers. So it's perfectly possible that raising wages actually increases demand for labor. Okay? That's why it can work out that way. And we have no reason to believe that any one of these kinds of labor demand curves is more likely than another one. All of them are possible. Okay? And that changes the whole nature of the view of the wage and employment relationship. So I'm not going to do that.
Could the neoclassical view hold in a credit economy where instead of consumption being fueled by wages, it's fueled by credit, as we saw like a buildup of private credit in the 1990s leading up to the crash? Would the classical case potentially hold there where lower wages don't really affect demand much because they borrow to spend instead?
Yeah, I mean, so something definitely happened in the English-speaking world where consumption since 1980 has been increasingly fueled by debt. Okay, Keynes doesn't really have that in the general theory, and you know, it really wasn't much of a real-world phenomenon in the post-war period until the 1980s. But that has become an additional source of demand when workers are you know, optimistic about the future, and then a collapse of demand when they're worried about the future. They stop borrowing, they stop spending, and we collapse. That's what happened in helped to take us into the global financial crisis. Okay, we only have a few minutes. I think, you know, the technical stuff I'm going to have to skip this.
Could you send us the slides afterwards so we can still send them out?
Okay.
Thank
We
you.
could have an event in the future. We'll carry on from where we left off.
Yeah. Let me go to the chapter 24 of the general theory, the last chapter, because in chapter 24, Keynes, you know, he's reaching a conclusion. You know, what have we learned from this new way of looking at the economy? The invisible hand doesn't work. We're in the Great Depression. We're going to have to make major changes. This is where Keynes gets radical. Now, Keynes, you know, was a member of the elite. He was an elitist. He said, when the revolution comes, I'll be on the side of the bourgeoisie, not on the side of the workers. But on the other hand, Keynes had very strong moral beliefs. And, you know, when he recognized the implications of the general theory, and when he saw the Great Depression in the Western world, and then the rise of the Soviet Union, which did not have a Great Depression, and he was worried that a Bolshevik kind of revolution could come to the West, he realized he needed to propose fairly radical policies. So he says, the outstanding faults of capitalism are that it doesn't provide full employment, and that it provides an arbitrary and inequitable distribution of income. Arbitrary, so it's not true that you get what you deserve. Okay, that is not true. And second, that it is excessively unequal. The distribution is too unequal. He says, orthodoxy says you need the inequality because rich people save. Saving finances investment, so that's good. Keeping interest rates high helps to reward the savers. So high interest rates, high inequality is good. Keynes says, we do need some inequality. We need to reward initiative. Okay, so people who are innovative and taking risks, yes, they deserve to get a bit more. And he says, sort of as an aside, we need to divert cruelty to tyranny over balance sheets instead of tyranny over people. Okay, so let them try to find ways to make money and let them get some reward for doing that. But too much inequality leads to stagnation, because the high income people don't consume a lot of their income, and that leads to insufficient aggregate demand. It also discourages investment. Why would firms invest if most of the population is too poor to buy very much? And finally, a high interest rate keeps investment low. And Keynes completely dismisses the argument that saving finances investment. He says, no, it's the reverse. Investment creates saving. I didn't have a chance to go through that theory, but Keynes flips this over. It is investment that creates saving, not saving finances investment. So he proposes what he calls moderately conservative policies to rectify these faults. First, a permanently low interest rate. Keynes would have supported ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, not for recession, but always ZIRP. Why? He says you want to euthanize the rentier class, people who collect income without taking risk just by earning interest. That's what he means. Okay, what does euthanize mean? It means kill. This is pretty radical. Okay, he didn't mean literally, but he meant wipe them out by lowering interest rates. All right, and he says, this will establish a lower necessary return for capital to beat, and it allows the game to be played for lower stakes. We will end up with more capital investment. We will end up with more productive capacity. But that by itself is not enough. We're still not going to get enough investment in order to fill the demand gap and get us to full employment. What we need to do is socialize investment. Again, very radical term, euthanize, socialize. Okay, now did he mean Soviet style socialism? The answer is clearly no. Keynes was no socialist. He was not clear what he meant. He said, we don't need state socialism. We don't need the state to own the means of production. He said, what we need is for the state to determine the scale of investment and the reward to investment. Okay, so exactly what he meant, we don't know. He could have meant public infrastructure investment. He could have meant some kind of directive of the state to try to increase private investment. We're not sure. And finally, the system doesn't seriously misemploy resources. It just doesn't employ enough of them. So what we need to do is get closer to full employment through state being more involved in the economy. And then he says neoclassical theory can come into its own. So once we've got to full employment, we can let the markets operate. Okay, go back to the invisible hand, but the invisible hand won't get us to full employment. It requires the government. So he warns the world won't tolerate unemployment longer. Laissez-faire leads to mercantilism, which then leads to war. We have to find another way to achieve full employment at home instead of trying to export our unemployment. And he was very worried that the unemployment, the search for external markets, the possibility of war, and then the possibility of revolution would be the result if we didn't tackle these problems. So I'll stop.
Thank you so.
Yeah. I guess in summary, the neoclassical system starts in the labor market. That would be the main, just a quick talking point for everyone here in the argument against it. What's the main problem? Is it the interdependence of demand and supply, or is it the fact that Say's law doesn't hold? What would be the quick summary?
Yes, that employment is determined by effective demand, and demand does not create its own supply. Supply doesn't create its own demand. It's not a supply-driven economy. It's a demand-driven economy. We need to get demand up and keep it high in order to get supply up to a level that will fully employ the population. Okay.
I don't think we have time for a Q&A now, so maybe in the future we'll have you on again and let people can have questions. But thank you very much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.